Hey, thank you so much, Anne. I think all of us can agree that we really appreciate her work and putting this on year after year. So I have nothing to disclose, as it says here. I'm board certified in internal medicine. I had a fairly conservative medical upbringing, so to speak. But I got involved in the work that I do because of meeting two people. One of them was Dr. William Donald Kelley, and the other was Dr. Nicholas Gonzalez. When I was in medical school, I was assigned as part of my training to an internal medicine team, and Nick was the intern on that team. So he and I worked closely together for 6 weeks in that setting. And what I found was that he was an incredibly brilliant doctor, and his patients loved him. But he was also already engaged in a research project looking at the work of Dr. William Donald Kelley. And he was willing to talk to anyone who would listen about what he was finding in Kelley's files. I was certainly willing to listen, and I'd like to tell you about a couple of those cases right now. The first one is a woman with metastatic uterine cancer. Now, she was diagnosed with uterine cancer in 1969, and she was treated with radiation and surgery, which for most patients is going to be a cure. In her case, however, after about a year's worth of abdominal pain, they discovered she had a mass in her pelvis. They were afraid her intestines weren't going to obstruct, so they took it out. And it was found to be metastatic uterine cancer. She also had multiple little spots on her lungs on a chest x-ray, and those spots hadn't been there before. So they determined metastatic uterine cancer. And they treated her with a medication that just made her sick. So after a few months, she stopped that treatment and started treatment with Dr. Kelley. 11 years later, at the time that Nick was wrapping up his research project, she was alive and well, and she'd had another chest x-ray in the interim that showed all of those masses had disappeared. She actually passed away. We did a little follow-up via the internet and discovered that she passed away in the year 2009 at age 95. So she outlived the diagnosis of metastatic uterine cancer by something in the neighborhood of 30 years. And that's, 30 months would have been remarkable. So she well outlived what would be expected. Another patient of Dr. Kelley's, and this one actually resonated even more with me because as a medical student, I had done a rotation in urology, and I had seen some patients with metastatic prostate cancer who were admitted for pain control. So I'd seen some gentlemen rather like this one. Now bear in mind, this is before CAT scans, before PSA. So it took them a year to figure out that the reason a bone collapsed in his spine in 1975 was because he had metastatic prostate cancer. It was finally diagnosed in June of '76. He was admitted to the hospital started on hormone treatment and radiation. A month later, admitted again, disoriented, terrible pain, more radiation, but he was pretty much given up for terminal. He then decided to quit everything. He started with Dr. Kelley. And at the time that Nick was finishing up his research project, he was working part-time, and he was playing the violin in a ragtime band, which I can tell you the patients that I'd seen in the hospital did not look like they were planning to play the violin in a ragtime band. So I was impressed, and that is what made me, those cases like that is what made me decide that this work needed to be my life's project. He actually did pass away. I don't know why. I tracked him down online, and he did pass away in March of 1988 at age 82, but still, he'd outlived a terrible prognosis by quite some number of years. So who then was Dr. Kelley? Dr. Kelley was an orthodontist by training. And he had an academic interest in nutrition because he had noticed in the course of his orthodontic career that children with crooked teeth were brought in by parents with perfect teeth. And he had been taught that crooked teeth were genetic. So he would ask the parents, well, did you ever need braces? And they'd say, no, my teeth were fine. But here their kids had crooked teeth. And so he did a little bit of research, discovered the work of a man named Dr. Weston Price, who many of you may have heard of. But Weston Price traveled the world in the 1920s looking at the health, and especially the dentition, since he was a dentist, of people in multiple parts of the world where the people had switched from their indigenous diet, their traditional diet, to the so-called diet of civilization, white flour, white sugar, basic junk. And what he found was that those whose parents had been eating properly had beautiful teeth, like the ones up top, but those whose parents had switched to a more refined diet had terrible teeth, like the ones on the bottom. So that made sense to Dr. Kelley, based on what he was seeing, but it didn't make him change his own behavior. It was an academic belief. But that changed for him when he was in his late 30s. This would be the early 1960s. And he developed some sort of terrible illness. He was losing weight like crazy, and eventually he was found to have a mass in his abdomen. Now, this was before CAT scans. This was before needle biopsies. The only way to definitively make that diagnosis would have been to take him to the operating room, cut him open, and get a sample that way. And his doctors felt like this was clearly terminal. There was no reason to put him through that. They told him, look, you've probably got pancreatic cancer, we're not sure. But whatever it is, it's bad, and you just need to go home and get your affairs in order. So what he did first was he cleaned up his act as far as his diet went. It went from academic knowledge to something he was putting into practice. He switched to a mostly raw foods diet, mostly vegetarian, not completely vegan though. And with that diet, he stabilized. He wasn't getting better, but he wasn't getting worse. And that was an improvement from a rapid downhill course. But he was still having terrible, terrible digestive problems. And so he went to see a pharmacist, and the pharmacist said, well, maybe what you need is pancreatic enzymes. And so he started to take pancreatic enzymes to help his digestion. Now, what he noticed, though, was when he started to take pancreatic enzymes, and let's get into a little riff here about what are enzymes anyway. Enzymes are very large proteins that catalyze reactions. So what do I mean by that? They facilitate a reaction that otherwise would take, 100 years to happen. Like, for example, if you put some cornstarch in a glass of water and don't do anything, it will just sit there. But if you spit into it, the amylase in your saliva will break down that starch, and you'll wind up with sugar water. So enzymes catalyze reactions. They make things happen, and that's what life depends on. So there are about 5,000 different types of reactions that occur, and enzymes are almost always proteins. They are required for nutrition, and the various digestive enzymes have actually been known for a long time. Proteases or proteolytic enzymes, unfortunately, I tend to use those words interchangeably, and that's the type of enzyme that I'll mainly be talking about in this lecture. But lipases that work on fat, amylases that work on carbohydrates, and they're all very important for digestion. So Dr. Kelley started taking those enzymes, and his digestion improved. He thought things were so much better that he started taking enzymes around the clock, taking them constantly. And what he noticed with that was not only did his digestion improve, but the character of the mass in his abdomen started to change. It started to feel softer, like maybe it was changing its character. And so being scientifically trained, being the kind of guy that if he noticed something, he would go off to the library and try to find more, he said, well, has anybody else ever thought that pancreatic enzymes might have something to do with cancer? And what he found was the work of a man named Dr. John Beard. Now, Dr. Beard was an embryologist, a student of the very, very early stages of life. And he was a professor at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And what Beard had observed, he felt that cancer looked and acted a lot like some of the very early stages of life, like the embryo. He wasn't the only one that noticed this, but he was one of the first to comment that it looks and acts a lot like a specific tissue. And that specific tissue is called the trophoblast. It's the earliest stages of the placenta. The placenta is the connection between the mother and baby that allows for nutrients to be passed from the mother's blood to the baby and allows for waste to be gotten rid of. And the job of the trophoblast when the embryo passes into the uterus is to latch on, to invade, and to build a blood supply so that all this exchange of nutrients and stuff can happen. A lot like cancer, looks and acts like cancer. But there's one big difference. At a certain point, the trophoblast stops. It stops invading. It stops working its way in. It matures, turns into the placenta, which eventually just neatly peels off, leaving the uterus intact for the next pregnancy. But cancer just keeps going. So Beard thought, if I could figure out the signal that makes that trophoblast stop and turn into the placenta, I can figure out a potential answer for cancer. And he looked at a lot of different things that were happening in the body of the mother, in the body of the baby, and what he found was that in a number of different species, the thing that was happening at the time that the trophoblast changed its character was that the baby was making pancreatic enzymes. Now, those enzymes were already known to be functioning in digestion. I mean, yes, this was 100 years ago. They didn't really know what a protein was too well, but they'd already characterized these digestive ferments, as they called them, actually noticing the similarity to fermentation in food. And so these things were already known and only believed to have a function in the digestion of food. So here this baby is making enzymes at 2 months into a 9-month gestation. Why? Why would you be making them that early when you're not going to see a meal for 7 more months? Well, if the role of the enzymes is to control the behavior of the trophoblast, it makes all kinds of sense. So Beard was not a physician. He was a scientist, and so he was not in a position to try this out for himself on human beings. He tried it out in a mouse model and actually got some interesting, good results. But then a number of physicians tried it themselves, and there was a lot of back and forth about this in the early 20th century. Some doctors got good results, some did not. Beard said when it doesn't work, it's because you don't have good quality enzymes. Bear in mind that there was no refrigeration except for big meat packing plants. So a doctor's office might have an ice box, but more likely they had nothing. And typically doctors wanted to use the stuff that was commercially available, and the quality varied a lot. And if they mixed up the dried enzymes in water and then left it sitting around, what you'd wind up with was enzyme soup, ineffective. Now, Beard wrote all this up in a book that was published in 1911 called The Enzyme Therapy of Cancer and Its Scientific Basis. And then, again, a lot of back and forth. Does it work? Does it not work? Et cetera, et cetera. But what wound up happening around the same time was that something came along that was billed as an easy, cheap, effective, non-toxic form of treatment for every kind of cancer, and that was radiation. So Madame Curie was a very interesting woman, kind of a spokesperson for radiation. Radiation was used for all kinds of things. Here's an advertisement for face cream to help you get that youthful glow back. And so radiation was billed as this magic bullet, and it wasn't until another 20 or 30 years that people realized it was not easy, not inexpensive, in the sense that there were a lot of complications. People died as a result of radiation, including Madame Curie. But by that time, Dr. Beard was dead and gone. And there were some other practitioners that picked up on enzymes over the succeeding years. One in particular that I think is kind of interesting is a guy named Dr. Shively. Dr. Shively was actually a surgeon, very successful surgeon, but when he came toward the end of his career, he learned of Beard's work and decided to try it out using intravenous enzymes. Beard had used injectable enzymes, which apparently were extremely painful, according to one of his critics. And Shively was using intravenous enzymes. He had some interesting results. I've got a copy of the manuscript that he put together after the FDA shut him down. But there were cases where tumor masses went away or collections of fluid resolved. The catch was that I don't think that either he or his patients realized that a maintenance treatment might be necessary. They tended, I believe, to look at it more like antibiotics, where the magic thing of the 50s, where you take the antibiotic and you get over it and you're done. So what would happen is that they would get their treatment, and then 6 months, a year later, they'd be sick again, and they'd just go off and do something else. Whereas what I think is that a maintenance treatment of some kind would have been helpful. But that gives you a little bit of history about the use of enzymes. But what about, is there any modern support for what Dr. Beard had to say? Well, first of all, the molecular mechanisms that the trophoblast uses to invade and to create a blood supply are exactly the same as what cancer uses, and that's been established. In fact, the similarities of cancer and the trophoblast are pretty much commonly accepted in medical circles that are interested in that in general. Secondly, there are some, the general model of cancer that's very dominant right now is that it's all based on a genetic mutation. But there are some that would say that it's a problem of development, and the genetic mutations come along as a byproduct of that. That it's cells that go back to a more primitive appearance and action, which kind of goes along with what Beard would have said. The babies do start making pancreatic enzymes extremely early in development. That has been confirmed. And both cancer cells and trophoblast cells have these receptors, kind of sticking out of the cell, where a pancreatic enzyme, a proteolytic enzyme, can come and snip off the top, and that changes the behavior of the cell. So there's a potential mechanism for how enzymes might be working. A few other comments. If you go talk to a doctor about what do pancreatic enzymes do, they will say they only digest food, that's it. But in fact, in the last 15 years or so, there's been a lot of research about proteolytic enzymes that they do a lot of other things. I actually have one article that was published in the last couple of years by some academics. It's 80 pages long, talking about different things that proteolytic enzymes do in the body. So it's way beyond digestion. There are some studies that say that if you swallow them, they can be absorbed. And the last little point about raw pancreas, there's actually a form of pancreatic insufficiency that happens in dogs. And so what they did was take some dogs, put some tubes down these poor dogs' throats to see how much active enzyme was supplied, either by feeding them pharmaceutical enzymes or by feeding them raw pancreas. And actually, raw pancreas worked the best. Now, humans do not like raw pancreas, from what I gather. I've never tried it myself, but there's some notes in the literature from Beard's era that people do not like it at all. Dogs think it's great. But what we use, our freeze-dried pancreas, it's about as close to raw pancreas as you're going to get. So it turns out that may actually be the best way to deliver pancreatic enzymes to the gut. So all of this and more is talked about in the book, The Trophoblast and the Origins of Cancer, that Dr. Gonzalez and I did. But I also did an updated article that was published last year, and you can find that either by going to PubMed, it's for free, freely available, or you can get it off my website. So that's the background on pancreatic enzymes. So at this point in Dr. Kelley's trajectory, we have him eating a raw diet, mostly vegetarian, cleaned up. We have him taking pancreatic enzymes. His tumor is softening up, and things seem to be going pretty well for a while. But then what happened is he started to get sick. He started to get flu-like symptoms, aches and pains, nausea. He felt terrible. And in fact, he felt so terrible that he was having a hard time taking his enzymes. So he stopped them for a few days and felt better. But then almost as soon as he went back on them, he got sick again. Same thing happened a few times. Tumor seemed to be going in the wrong direction, and he thought, well, maybe what I've got is that these enzymes are creating waste materials and debris, and I got to figure out how to get rid of this. Now, he claimed that the solution he came up with came from something called the Merck manual, which is they bill themselves as the oldest continuously published medical textbook in existence, although at this point it's just digital. And what he found in there, he said, was coffee enemas. Now, you've already heard about coffee enemas, I'm sure, at this conference. And Dr. Gerson, another alternative practitioner, is well known for their use. But in fact, neither Kelley nor Gerson were the ones that came up with coffee enemas. In fact, I did a little research about coffee enemas, and I found references going back to the mid-1800s about their use and their value. And in fact, the oldest one, I think it was like 1860, and it was described as something as if everybody already knew about it, like as if it was in common use. I found one reference with a lecture by one of the Mayo brothers that started the Mayo Clinic saying that they were critically important in post-operative care. And another article by a surgeon in Uruguay that was very interesting, talking about their use for poisonings and for shock. So they've been around for a long time. Now, what do they do? The best demonstrated method of action is really just that they stimulate bile flow. And bile is where the liver gets rid of waste materials, so we think that's how they're working. But the bottom line for Dr. Kelley is he started doing them, he felt better. He was able to continue taking his pancreatic enzymes along with a number of other supplements that he found helpful. And so he wound up with the final program that he himself did to get better with dietary modifications, pancreatic enzymes, and other supplements, which I'm not going to get into, but there's a lot more to it, and detoxification. And with that, he got better. And so people started coming to him, not because they wanted their teeth straightened, but because they wanted their cancer straightened. They said, what did you do, and can we do it too? And so bit by bit, his practice changed from orthodontics to alternative cancer therapist. He published a book around 1969 called One Answer to Cancer, in which he basically told people how to do it, and that got him into quite a bit of trouble with the medical community. And then in subsequent years, he wound up actually making some modifications to his program, and I'm not going to get into the backstory on this because I simply don't have time. But what he found was that different people needed different types of diets. What he wound up believing is that this tied into the function of the autonomic nervous system, and that patients with an overactive sympathetic stress response system would develop one type of cancer, the carcinomas, and do better with magnesium and potassium, whereas there was another group with the immune cancers, like lymphomas or leukemias, that would do better with a more carnivorous diet and with a different set of supplements. But everybody got pancreatic enzymes, and everybody did coffee enemas. And so if you want more information about why different people might want different types of diets, there are some other lectures that I've given that are available on YouTube, and also there's the book, Nutrition in the Autonomic Nervous System, or a lecture series that Dr. Gonzalez did called Different Diets, Different Types, or something like that. I don't remember the exact title, but it is available. It can be purchased. So that then is the program that Dr. Kelley was using at the time that Nick started his research. And things were going along fairly well for Dr. Kelley until 1980, when he got involved in the treatment of a man named Steve McQueen, the movie actor. McQueen had been exposed to asbestos, and anybody that's seen the advertisements for lawyers on television knows that asbestos can cause cancer, especially a rather nasty type of cancer called mesothelioma. So McQueen was diagnosed with that in 1979. No, radiation and chemo don't work. They didn't work then, they don't work now, but he got it anyway, and when it didn't work, he went to Mexico and was treated by a number of people, including Dr. Kelley. And McQueen apparently was a terrible patient, non-compliant with diet. He was smuggling in ice cream and junk food, generally a pain to deal with, and when he actually did pass away, Dr. Kelley was treated by the national news media as if he killed McQueen. So Kelley was raked over the coals for that, and here's a picture of him from that era where he's looking kind of mournful. But in fact, it was the foofara, so to speak, over McQueen's death that actually led to Nick Gonzalez meeting Dr. Kelley, because Nick had been a journalist before he went to medical school, and a mutual acquaintance in the journalistic world asked him to go check out Dr. Kelley to see if there was anything valid there, since he was in medical school at the time. So that's what started Nick's investigation of Kelley, and he went through 10,000 charts, which boggles my brain actually, because this was in the days of paper charts, so it wasn't like he was using a search engine to go through charts. He was going through paper to find out what was of value. He mailed out questionnaires, he interviewed a number of them at length, and he wound up putting together a monograph that had 50 cases in it, and I've already told you about 2 of them. Now, the plan with that was to try to get it published, but by this time I was actually involved. I read that book in multiple iterations myself back then. So the plan was to either get it published as case reports in medical journals or to get it published as an intact book. What Nick ran into was that the journal editors simply didn't want to believe that the cases were real. We had the medical records, offered to send them the medical records, they didn't want to hear it. In other words, it was, we've made up our mind, don't confuse us with data. As far as the book publishers went, they said, well, for the most part it was just rejected with no comment, but one of them actually put in writing, we would love to publish this book, we think it's important, but we also think our medical division would have a real problem with it. In the meantime, life with Dr. Kelley had gotten more difficult, and for a while there, Nick and I were actually living in the same house with Dr. Kelley, but he had a rough life. If you read anything of what he put out in the 90s, he got a little paranoid, quite frankly, and we wound up deciding that we needed to just move on and try to reproduce the work. The book was eventually published under the title One Man Alone, and that is available here, I believe, but also through Amazon. So Nick started his own practice then in 1987. I wound up going to finish my internal medicine training and then joined him and started seeing patients in the early 90s. And after 6 years of practice, Nick was actually invited to go present cases at the National Cancer Institute. And so he put together 25 cases, went off with the medical records and the slides. We put together a booklet of like a little monograph that he took with him to distribute to the attendees at this meeting. And if you want to see what that looked like, you can, because it's been published now. But here's one of the cases out of that book. A gentleman with pancreatic cancer. He was diagnosed in August of 1991. He had a tumor in his pancreas, he had tumors in his liver, tumor in his lung, tumors in his bone and in his adrenal gland. They took out one of the lung tumors and found it was cancer, most likely pancreatic. That's what quite frankly, it doesn't really matter whether it was lung or pancreas. Either one would be terrible prognosis. He was told he'd be dead in a few months. He started with Dr. Gonzalez in December of 91. He had a scan in February of 93, and the scan actually showed that everything looked the same. But he didn't care. He'd been told he'd be dead by then, well by then, and so he just kept plugging on with his program, and that presentation for the NCI was a little bit later that year. But in fact, in July of 1998, he had another scan where everything was gone. And he wound up passing away, unfortunately, in 2005 after he was in a really nasty car accident. But he, again, made it 14 years with a diagnosis that 14 months would have been remarkable and 14 weeks more typical. So after that presentation that Dr. Gonzalez did at the National Cancer Institute, they suggested that we do a pilot study, as it's called, a single-arm study with pancreatic cancer. Now, sometimes people will think, because you'll hear pancreatic cancer in terms of research, we use pancreatic enzymes, maybe that's all we treat. In fact, we have treated a lot of different types of cancer, but pancreatic cancer was what we picked as a research project simply because the prognosis is fairly uniform. In other words, with breast cancer, if somebody lives a long time, it may just be that they have a more indolent form, a slower growing form. But pancreatic cancer is typically pretty standard and pretty bad, unfortunately. And so it makes it easier to potentially get meaningful results. So what we were actually told verbally by one of the people at the NCI was that if we got 10 patients in this pilot study and we had 3 of them alive at a year, that would be remarkable. In fact, we did a lot better than that. Our 1-year survival was at 81%, so that was closer. As I recall, it was 8 out of 11. And, even looking at those numbers, in some cases we didn't have the best supportive care. In other words, patients would have problems and their doctors would not really take good care of them. So had we had better supportive care, it might have done better. But anyway, that was the pilot study results, which you can see are a lot better than the standard outcome for that illness. And so based on that, we went on to a more, a direct comparison of our regimen versus chemotherapy. And this was funded by what was called then the National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine, and supervised by the National Cancer Institute and administered through one of the major medical centers in New York. Unfortunately, this study was pretty much of a disaster from the get-go. It was, a study of a comprehensive lifestyle change, and the practitioners, the academics who had total control of the study, I might add, were much more in the pharmaceutical mindset. So, for example, our pilot study had what we call a lead-in period. In other words, people weren't formally entered until after they'd been on it for a month. Why? Well, it's a lifestyle change, and so people can, with the best will in the world, not be physically able to do it, and sometimes people won't do it. They realize it's a big commitment, they decide they'd rather not. And so what happened, though, with our clinical trial was that there was no lead-in period because we couldn't get them to agree to it. And the net result was that about a quarter of the patients never started or were not doing it at the end of a week. But in the final publication, they were still counted as treatment and, in fact, treatment failures for our therapy. Secondly, patients had to go see a doctor once a month because for chemotherapy, that's important. For our therapy, not so much, but with chemo, it's toxic. And so you need to be sure that you're not doing more damage to the patient than good for the cancer, so to speak. And finally, we could not refuse any admission. So there were people that were sent to us that obviously didn't meet the entry criteria, but we were told you gotta treat them. So, like I said, a big mess. By the time it was over, 30 out of 39 patients on our arm of this study followed it incompletely, not at all, or briefly. And this is just a little excerpt from a letter by one of the supervisory people saying that at one of our team meetings, everyone in the room agreed that this was a big problem. But shortly after that letter was written, the study was closed down, and eventually a publication was written by the academics involved stating that our therapy didn't work and saying absolutely nothing about the issues with adherence that meant that from our point of view, the data was worthless. So if you go to Wikipedia, that's what you'll read, but that's not how it came out as far as we're concerned. Dr. Gonzalez wrote a very long book called What Went Wrong, detailing blow by blow exactly what happened. I wrote something that's a little shorter that I would like to think maybe is more manageable, called Research Battles, Survival Tips from a Veteran, which you can find on PubMed and is freely available. So, there is one good thing that came out of that unfortunate clinical trial, and it's still hard for me to talk about it, quite frankly, but one good thing. A patient of mine, she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in December she got an abnormal CAT scan in December. Formally speaking, the diagnosis was made in February. She had a mass in her pancreas. It was biopsied. Her local hospital said, looks like pancreatic cancer, the bad kind. The slides were sent to the Mayo. They confirmed it. And she heard about the clinical trial. So she sent in her records, and they were reviewed. They said, sure, hop on a plane, come on over. So she flew across the country. And based on the same records that she had sent ahead of time, the academics involved said, well, wait a minute. Why aren't you getting surgery? And she said, I don't want surgery. And they said, well, then you can't be in the trial, because the trial is only for people that can't get surgery. And she said, well, if I don't get surgery, how does that make me different from the ones that can't get surgery? And they said, well, this is just the way it is. So she showed up in my office later that day in tears. You know, she already had the appointment with me, and she showed up in tears. And I said, she was afraid I was going to refuse to treat her. But I went ahead and treated her. I gave her a protocol. I walked her through what to do. She went home. She did it. She's still alive. The last time I spoke with her was, actually, I could get a little choked up here, sorry. The last time I spoke with her was in last December, and she actually called me because she wanted me to chat with one of her granddaughters who is interested in medicine. And her granddaughter happens to be 22, which means that she was born around the same time that this patient was diagnosed. She would have never gotten to know her grandmother if she hadn't done the work to do this protocol. So once we got beyond the bitter disappointment of that clinical trial, what we focused on was case reports. So just to give you an idea of what makes a good case report, clear-cut active cancer when they started with us could not have been cured by any other treatment, prolonged survival, or tumor shrinkage, or ideally both. And we wrote a whole article about the topic of case reports versus statistics and why we function the way that we do. So here's another case report, and this is a gentleman who was on the other kind of diet. The first patient, the pancreatic cancer patient, was on a more vegetarian diet. This gentleman had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And so in October of 1995, he developed swelling from the waist down, and a CAT scan was done that showed enlarged lymph nodes throughout his abdomen. A biopsy showed follicular lymphoma, and he actually refused conventional treatment and started with me a couple of months, a month later. Now, we didn't get scans for a while, and part of the issue is radiation, but also part of the issue is that many times in the short run, things can look worse before they look better. So I'm not really scan happy particularly for that reason. But he wound up getting a scan I forget why, but anyway, he got one in May of 2001, and all of the enlarged lymph nodes had resolved. And he's done fine. He's gotten another scan once or twice over the years, but I got a Christmas card from him. He's doing great. The last time I actually spoke to him, he's in his 60s now, and he was building a retaining wall out behind his new house. So, and he also went on a long... Oh yeah, wonderful. Well, yeah, so that's great. That's wonderful. So he actually went on a long trip in the Grand Canyon, out like river rafting for 3 weeks. So he's living his life. I'm sorry, what does it say? I can't read it. Okay. So Nick was working on collections of case reports at the time he passed away, which has subsequently been gotten out by his widow posthumously. So there's some of my cases, a lot of his cases in there. But since he passed, and of course I'm continuing the work, so this is somebody that I saw after Nick left us, and that is a gentleman who he had blood in his stool in May of 2014. And so he goes in to see his doctors, and they find colon cancer and wind up removing part of his colon. And he had some lymph nodes involved, which is a bad sign. He started on a protocol he put together for himself, but his CEA, a blood marker, was going up. And so he wound up starting chemotherapy, which he got from January to June of 2015. And on that, he developed a peripheral neuropathy, and he has told me that he felt so horrible on chemotherapy that he would rather be dead than get it anymore. So he tried that out, and then at the end of that 6-month period, they discovered on a scan that he had a liver tumor, and when they looked back at his scan that had been done in December, they said, oh gosh, it was there then too, and now it's bigger. So obviously chemotherapy did not work. So he wound up getting that nodule, that mass in the liver removed in February of 2016. But when they took it out, the edge was involved with cancer, a positive margin, as we say in the trade. So what that means, nothing positive about it. It means that there's cancer left behind because the cut was in the middle of it. So there was cancer left behind. And he came in to start with me a few months later in April. And then he got a scan in late June, early July, and it showed that the liver tumor had recurred, not surprising because of that, the positive margin, the tumor left behind. But he also had a new tumor on his lung. And you might say, well, gosh, maybe the enzymes are working. But in fact, it had been, the scans that they were comparing to were probably from January, and so there'd been a fairly long period before he started with me. And then you throw in that one of the first things we see with this protocol is inflammation and irritation. So he wound up, his doctors told him, look, you got to get the liver thing out, you got to get the lung thing out, you got to get back on chemotherapy. And he went ahead with the liver part of it. So he got that mass removed in July of 2016, and what was interesting was that the pathology report said metastatic nodule, colorectal type adenocarcinoma, no surprise there, with no residual viable tumor identified. So what that means is, yes, it was there, but it was dead. Interesting. And so he wound up deciding he wasn't going to get that lung thing out, and he wasn't going to get any more chemo. He just started with me, or continued with me. And bit by bit, the lung mass has gone away. He's never had any more disease in the liver. So he's had no evidence of disease for a few years now. His oncologist said, every oncologist sees this. You have one or two patients that you just don't know why they get better, but they do. Did the oncologist ever ask him what he was doing? No. So anyway, so that's a gentleman that's done very well, and I've been able to publish his case in a medical journal. So I think what I'm going to do, just tips for general health. Take some pancreatic enzymes. They're great for digestion, and by doing that, just even taking a few with your meals, it will help your own body's enzymes go work on cancer cells or precursor cells. So I think that a few enzymes are valuable for everybody. Coffee enemas, I think you've already heard about them. They're great. Nobody ever believes me, but almost without exception, the coffee enemas have become the favorite part of the treatment that I offer. They love them. Diet, I don't think that one diet fits all. Again, because of time, I couldn't get into extensive discussion of that. But whole unprocessed foods, and thank you for your time. So, any questions?
I have a quick question. I've done wheatgrass enemas in the past. Is it basically done the same way? And what kind of coffee do you use for a coffee enema?
Coffee enemas have been our main backbone. Every now and then with people that are extremely sensitive to caffeine, we'll use chlorophyll, so wheatgrass would be along the same line. As far as what kind of coffee, believe it or not, we actually did a blinded study with coffee types back in the 90s. We had a research agreement with Procter & Gamble for a while, and they make Folgers. So they had the ability to standardize how much caffeine was in some samples and to do something for color. So we tried out a number of different types of coffee, including the very light roast. And what we found, and of course the only thing we could really go by was how did people feel after they did them. So we supplied the product to various people, including me. And what we found was that there were some people, they seemed to be the chemically sensitive, who preferred the lighter roast. but for most people, they didn't care. And so if people want to use the light roast, that's fine. The Proctor people were a little nervous about light roast because they said that when it comes to drinking coffee, if the roast is too light, people can develop allergies to it. So I have no idea if that's correct or not, but we tell them organic and beyond that, whatever you want.
And the best place to get the tubing? No.
There's a lot of different places. I mean, right at the moment, I'm recommending the silicone stuff that's made by Pure Life Enema, but I'm sure there's other options as well.
And do you have this information on your website?
I don't have it freely available simply because we live in a litigious world, and I don't want somebody that I never met saying that I told them how to do coffee enemas and they stuck the tube up their nose or did something stupid. So yeah, I don't have the specific directions, but I'm sure Anne could give you information on that.
Thank you very much.
Next. My patients do coffee enemas every day, usually morning and afternoon when they're sicker. Generally speaking, it tapers off after a while. But like I said, most people love them, so they really, once they get used to it, they don't mind. The closest commercially available product to what I use is made by the company Allergy Research Group, and it's called Pancreas. They have several different versions. The pork one is what I recommend.
The pork one?
Yes, the company is called Allergy Research Group. They also sell under the label Nutricology. It's the same company, but a different label.
Thank you for your presentation. My name's Jamie. I've come here from Australia. I have pancreatic cancer, with mets on my lungs. And I just wanted to clarify that you are, that was one of my questions, similar to, I have Creon is my standard. Is that also classifies as the pancreatic enzymes that you're referring to?
Creon is a pharmaceutical product, and it's much more heavily processed than what I use. And so it's really not the same thing. That was where I made the comment about raw pancreas versus, talking about the study in dogs. I would suggest look up my article because I get into it a bit more there. But it's not the same thing. It'll help you digest your food, but whether it really has the same effect or is even necessary, it can be pretty expensive.
And the oxbile versions that are like done by Thorne, you might be familiar. No, don't.
Yeah, theoretically, oxbile helps them be absorbed. On a practical level, I don't use them.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Go ahead.
How many enzymes are required daily, and do you recommend any other supplements?
Yeah, there's a lot more supplements on the program. So those of you who saw the video yesterday that Dr. Turner played, I just want to add for the record that Bob, probably about a quarter of the supplements he takes were his idea, not mine. He tends to call me up and say, can I add this? Can I add that? And I'm like, if it's okay, I say sure. But anyway, so there are more supplements though, and usually I tell people it'll be between 150 and 200 pills a day total. As far as the doses, I really can't give you specifics because that's where the medical community doesn't recommend that I tell people how to treat themselves. So I value my medical license, so I don't answer that question. Well, the coffee enemas really don't help by clearing stuff out of the colon. The way that they actually give benefit, I believe, is by stuff getting absorbed across the wall of the intestine, getting into the bloodstream, and then going up through the portal system of the blood system to the liver. So the mechanism of action is different, and I think coffee enemas are extremely safe, and it's easier. You don't have to go to a special place to get special equipment, so that's why we mainly focus on that.
What, daily for the rest of your life, or when you're on
People do cut them back mainly because of time, but like I said, most of the patients become quite fond of them, so, and no one ever believes it until they try it. So it's a rare thing that I find that people stop them altogether.
Do you know about like liver cleanses or gallbladder cleanses?
We use some of those things, and actually, I think I kind of blasted past it on the slides. But if you go to my website, there's a page called Detox, and you can get there off the front page. So I actually did a little thing about the history, there's some scientific research about liver flushes that I thought was pretty interesting. A very small study that somebody did a few years back. So yeah, we do use those.
Thank you for your presentation. What is your experience with non-operative bladder cancer?
We've had a few patients with bladder cancer over the years, and we've had some that have done extremely well. I will say, though, as a general rule, if something can be treated surgically, I do recommend doing the surgery. But I know with bladder cancer, that can be a matter of just simply snipping off something that's fairly superficial, but it can also be having the bladder removed, which obviously people are not too enthused about. So, I just kind of want to say for the record that I think surgery is a good idea when it's feasible.
This is non-operative.
Yeah, I'd need more specifics, and I get the feeling that Anne is standing right behind you wanting to close things down. So perhaps we could talk about that later. Oh, there's one more person.
So you mentioned nutracology, and I wanted to mention there's also a very good product by the same company called MCP powder, modified citrus pectin powder, for pectosol.
We're going to hear from Dr. Isaac Elias next, so he's the inventor of it. So that was fantastic. I want to testify, as I have earlier. I did my first coffee enema in February of 1995. I'm in love with coffee enemas, and I bet you the people who do them feel the same way, just as Dr. Isaacs is saying. We love it. It's me time. I'm completely about me during that time, and it's great to have that, where there's no other thing that interjects there. And I really do love it. And on our website, AnnieAppleseedProject.org, top-down menu that says information by cancer types, we have laid out how to. And semi-joking here, but the number one most important thing is cool it to room temperature.
Yes, definitely. Unless you want to be the star of a medical journal article, because people have done it,
Yes,
believe it or not.
yes.
They have put boiling hot coffee in. It is
Exactly.
not a good
Unbelievable.
idea.
Thank you so much. That was great. Thank you.